Mr. Speaker, I welcome the opportunity to participate in this most important feature of our Westminster system of governance. The sectoral debate affords members an opportunity to bring key aspects of national life into sharp focus and be the voice of those we have been elected to serve. It is important, Mr. Speaker, that as responsible members of this honorable House, we remain mindful of the fact that this exercise is more about the people than we ourselves. Partisanship, cheerleading, point scoring, and empty rhetoric should take a back seat to the real issues, Mr. Speaker. I am more concerned, Mr. Speaker, about our capacity to fix more roads across Jamaica, bring water to more homes, provide more job opportunities for our young people, moving them, Mr. Speaker, from poverty to prosperity. And from the perspective, Mr. Speaker, of my portfolio, enhance the application of ICT and reduce costs to consumers by promoting competition in the telecom sector. Mr. Speaker, focusing on the real issues and engaging in honest debate can only serve to enhance our democracy and solidify, Mr. Speaker, the platform for holding people accountable. That, Mr. Speaker, is what my presentation is about this afternoon, holding people accountable. Mr. Speaker, I am starting with the man in the mirror. I'm starting by holding myself accountable. Mr. Speaker, I must first thank the great geometrician of the universe for guidance, protection, and inspiration, which keeps me fortified as I execute the work I was elected to do. I thank my family and friends for being that pillar of support on which I can always depend. Mr. Speaker, I must thank in a special way my constituents, the hard-working men and women of South Central St. Catherine. We are members of a family. Despite 2 years of hardship and suffering, we have banded together and remain steadfast in developing our constituency. We have rehabilitated a number of roads and other infrastructure in the constituency, facilitated social economic enablement, fostered a culture of community involvement through community-based organizations, and increased educational opportunities for the young people in South Central St. Catherine. This year, Mr. Speaker, we provided scholarships to a number of students in promoting e-learning through the Go GSAT and Caribbean exams platforms. This, Mr. Speaker, is what being accountable is about. Let me also thank, Mr. Speaker, my 3 councillors, Councillor Owen Palmer of the Homestead Division, Councillor Jennifer Hull of the Horizon Park Division, and Councillor Arthur Thompson of the Sydenham Division. They are right there.
Don't worry about them, not PNP doing.
Mr. Speaker, the leader of the opposition has entrusted me with this responsibility, and let me thank him for the confidence he reposes in me. I must commend you, Mr. Speaker, on the effective manner in which you have been presiding. The clerk, assistant clerk, and other members of staff of the Houses of Parliament must also be commended for their professionalism and diligent effort. Mr. Speaker, let me also specially recognize members of the Shadow Cabinet. I am honored to serve alongside them. My parliamentary colleagues on both sides, the Deputy Opposition Spokesman on Science, ICT, Digital Society Development and the Environment, Councillor Dwayne Smith of the Chancery Division. Stakeholders in my portfolio, the telecom sector, the environmental advocates, my constituency executive and other support groups, my personal and support staff, especially my constituency staff, Mr. Speaker, Ms. Sophia Deere, Ms. Georgine Sanders, Ms. Winsome Blake, Mr. Vernon Campbell, and Mr. Michael Marlin. Our financial partners in the constituency, Mr. Speaker, the various schools and community-based organizations that serve to enhance the social fabric of the constituency, the various agencies with whom I partner in uplifting the lives of the residents of South Central St. Catherine, the SDC, the National Work Agency, JCF, and others. I truly appreciate their support over the years, Mr. Speaker, and I have every confidence that we will continue working together as we bring hope, inspiration, and upliftment to the lives of our Jamaican brothers and sisters. Mr. Speaker, I am privileged to have oversight responsibility for sectors that are critical to national development and at the heart of everyday life. The sectors to which I refer, Mr. Speaker, all have key roles to play if we are to make that quantum leap forward as a nation. And before long, Mr. Speaker, make this country the place of choice to live, work, raise our families, and do business. Mr. Speaker, sound environmental management, the development of a digital society, the promotion of a knowledge-based economy, and the harnessing of innovation through cutting-edge scientific applications are examples of the ways in which we should be leveraging national resources for our economic prosperity. Let it be clear, Mr. Speaker, that if we, as a small developing country, are to be brought into the development mainstream, integrate ourselves into the global economy through technology and match wits with the rest of the world, science, ICT, the digital society, and the environment will have to be at the forefront.
They're here. They hear that minister of everything.
These areas, Mr. Speaker, are not only key to national advancement, but will be integral going forward in unleashing Jamaican talent, creating jobs for our people, and generating wealth as a result of owning the technology behind innovative products and being in a position, Mr. Speaker, to assert intellectual property rights. The portfolio I monitor, Mr. Speaker, has the enormous potential to spur backward and forward linkages, increase output at different levels of our economy, and most importantly, Mr. Speaker, trigger that unlocking of national potential for which this country has been yearning. Mr. Speaker, we take nothing away from the more traditional sectors such as agriculture, tourism, manufacturing, banking, and insurance. But it is quite clear, Mr. Speaker, that if we do not quickly transition from being mere consumers of products and services to being innovators and producers of products and the technology underpinning them, we will not be making the kinds of strides we need to make to turn our fortunes as a country around.
Solid argument from a clean labor right.
Let us for a moment, Mr. Speaker, think of the tremendous opportunities we will be providing for our young people if we own and develop more of the technology that is applied in agro-processing. The foreign exchange, Mr. Speaker, we will retain if more of the software used in the financial services sector were produced right here in Jamaica. The significant energy savings, Mr. Speaker, our manufacturers will realize if more of our people develop and deliver alternative energy solutions that are less costly than the ones now on the market. Make no mistake, Mr. Speaker, we on this side are about more action than talk.
Yes.
After all, Mr. Speaker, we all agree that talk is cheap.
Yeah, man.
And we have seen, Mr. Speaker, more talk than actual work. I've not taken us anywhere, Mr. Speaker, the last 2 years. In fact, Mr. Speaker, it's as though science, ICT, the digital society, and the environment have suffered from 2 missing years. And so, Mr. Speaker, since assuming monetary responsibility for this portfolio in November last year, I've made it my duty, Mr. Speaker, to set the wheels in motion and hit the ground running. I have made it my priority to get on with the work because there is no time for delay. Mr. Speaker, we on this side are not going to wait until we retake the reins of government to do the people's work and concentrate our efforts on creating a better Jamaica. As the Prime Minister in waiting said, Mr. Speaker, we are being diligent, methodical, and strategic in our thoughts and actions. Doing the things, Mr. Speaker, that are required to ensure that upon assuming office as government, Mr. Speaker, which I must say won't be too long from now, we would have been so familiar with our portfolio responsibilities, so on top of our game, Mr. Speaker, so poised for success, and so in touch with the concerns, needs, and desires of the Jamaican people that we will hit the ground running. Mr. Speaker, we will be a government of success, a government that upholds procedure and principle, a government that is fit for purpose, Mr. Speaker, and a government that is led by an effective leader. Mr. Speaker, we are starting from now to demonstrate to the people of Jamaica that we have a blueprint for success and a roadmap for development. That roadmap, Mr. Speaker, sets out where we are going, but more importantly, it delineates how we are going to get there. Our blueprint, Mr. Speaker, will enable us to rescue this nation of ours and improve the lives of those we serve. Mr. Speaker, in harnessing a culture of action rather than talk, we have assembled a technical support team comprising patriotic Jamaicans, persons who are diligent, professional, knowledgeable, and highly experienced. This technical support team partners with me as we immerse ourselves, Mr. Speaker, in the portfolio and build capacity within the ranks of the parliamentary opposition. Mr. Speaker, we meet regularly, engage in meaningful discussions, undertake robust research, critically analyze the policies and actions of the government, and put solutions on the table. Mr. Speaker, we are solutions-oriented opposition. We are not only in the business of objecting to things we are not in agreement with. We are in the business of putting solutions forward. Let me salute the various ICT stakeholders, Mr. Speaker, as well as the many entrepreneurs, academic scientists, and environmentalists with whom we have met. We are partners at the table, engaging in sector-improving dialogue, Mr. Speaker. Our relationships are predicated on mutual respect, shared interests, common concerns, and the advancement of Jamaica and its people. Mr. Speaker, I have already outlined the ultimate objective we should be seeking to attain as a country from a scientific perspective. We should be challenging ourselves and making the kind of investment that will see us achieving more as a country where science and technology is concerned. Greater levels of research, Mr. Speaker, more strategic focus on training and development of our human resources, as well as a social-cultural transformation, we see more of our people readily embracing science are needed at this time. Mr. Speaker, while we have tremendous gaps to bridge, we must note that Jamaica is not short of proponents, experts, and entrepreneurs that have been making strides in the natural and applied sciences. There is no more compelling example of this, Mr. Speaker, than the advances we have made in the exploitation of indigenous plants and other resources occurring in our natural environment. Distinguished Jamaican scholars like Professor Manley West, Errol Morrison, Peter Figueroa, Henry Lowe, and Elena Smota have been leading the way in medicinal research, genetic engineering, epidemiological work, and scientific entrepreneurship. Truth be told, Mr. Speaker, from our grandparents and parents who extolled the virtues of cerasee, lemongrass, peppermint, ginger, guinea hen weed, and moringa, as they look to these herbs, Mr. Speaker, in applying remedies to various ailments, to the more sophisticated and innovative scientists. Our people, Mr. Speaker, have long recognized the value of these plant materials. Mr. Speaker, the gains we have secured in exploiting these resources derived from our natural environment can be replicated, Mr. Speaker, in other plants. Marijuana, more popularly known as ganja, is one such plant, Mr. Speaker. And at this time, I wish to put the spotlight on it squarely. Mr. Speaker, there can be no denying that marijuana use sparks considerable controversy as a result of social, historic, cultural, and other biases. Many are wary of its psychoactive effects. The opposition, Mr. Speaker, believes that a referendum is the best way to decide whether to legalize ganja or not. But, Mr. Speaker, the government cannot know. While one cannot be certain as to which way the electorate would go in a referendum, Mr. Speaker, what we are certain of is that now is the time for ganja reform. First of all, Mr. Speaker, we need to move forthwith as a country in decriminalizing the possession of small quantities of ganja. Mr. Speaker, the Minister of Labour and Social Security came to this Honourable House with packages containing overseas farm work applications 2 weeks ago. He was quite clear, Mr. Speaker, in indicating that persons with criminal records need not apply. Now the question is, Mr. Speaker, how many of our constituents, poor, unemployed, semi-skilled youths, are not eligible to apply? Mr. Speaker, it is madness for us to be destroying the future of so many of our people, poor Jamaican youths in particular, Mr. Speaker, by giving them a criminal record for just one spliff. You're going to agree some more, man. Don't worry yourself. Early days. Mr. Speaker, we are urging resident magistrates to exercise greater discretion in our courts as it relates to the fingerprinting of persons, especially, Mr. Speaker, first-time offenders convicted of the possession of small quantities of ganja. What is required at this time, Mr. Speaker, is a more robust and aggressive program of public education. We must spare no effort as a country and as responsible members of our communities in sensitizing our people to the risk associated with smoking. Let me be quite clear, Mr. Speaker. While the opposition supports the decriminalization of the possession of small quantities of the herb, we discourage smoking as a practice. Mr. Speaker, the debate regarding the value of ganja and its significant medicinal properties is one that is already settled. Marijuana, Mr. Speaker, is a most valuable herb. Mr. Speaker, there is considerable research being done on the medicinal properties of marijuana. The reservation among many has to do with its psychoactive effects. However, Mr. Speaker, advances in research and scientific breakthroughs have led, Mr. Speaker, to the development of a non-psychoactive strain of the cannabis plant called Charlotte's Web. This particular strain, Mr. Speaker, is low in THC. THC, Mr. Speaker, is a psychoactive component of marijuana. And it is high, Mr. Speaker, in CBD, the non-psychoactive component with considerable medicinal potential. Mr. Speaker, this specialized strain of medical hemp has helped numerous pediatric patients suffering from epilepsy lead normal lives. Mr. Speaker, in Jamaica, approximately 10 in 1,000 persons suffer from epilepsy. Mr. Speaker, if you look at applying medicinal marijuana to the treatment of epilepsy, Mr. Speaker, and I'm sure the Minister of Health would welcome this, you will see a reduction in the strain on your health system, on our health system, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, we do not need to look abroad for examples of commendable and pioneering work in this era. Jamaica's very own, the late Professor Manley West, engaged in academic work that highlighted enormous potential and value of the herb. His pioneering work, Mr. Speaker, saw the emergence of cannabidiol and asbesol, potent drugs applied in the treatment of glaucoma and asthma, respectively. Medical literature, Mr. Speaker, supports the theory that the neuroprotective and anti-inflammatory properties of cannabinoids may also have positive therapeutic benefits in both type 1 and type 2 diabetes, multiple sclerosis, and a wide array of other diseases that collectively have a profound impact on the physical and economic health of the Jamaican people. Mr. Speaker, just to emphasize the seriousness of this, Mr. Speaker, approximately 15% of our population suffers from diabetes. Yes. Mr. Speaker, our scientists and researchers have stood in the forefront of the medical ganja. We were leading the way to ganja reform through medicinal applications at one point. We are falling behind, Mr. Speaker, and at risk of being left out completely if we do not get our act together and get it together quickly. We need, as a matter of urgency, Mr. Speaker, to put in place a legal framework for the medicinal use of marijuana. This framework, Mr. Speaker, will regulate the production, harvesting, distribution, and medicinal application of the plant, as well as, Mr. Speaker, as to establish protocols governing the relationship between the suppliers and users. Mr. Speaker, Jamaica is the lone global location that is clearly identifiable with the brand ganja. Many countries are now seeking to capitalize on the benefits of legalization. Uruguay, Mr. Speaker, Ghana, Romania, Canada, Brazil. And let us not forget, Mr. Speaker, that the vast majority of states in the United States of America have already acknowledged the economic and medicinal value of ganja. Mr. Speaker, in jurisdictions where marijuana is legalized, whether for medicinal or recreational purposes, the results include increased tax revenues, crimes and fines being replaced with jobs and revenue, and interest and investment, Mr. Speaker, in biotechnological research. Mr. Speaker, a legal framework can make what seems to be impossible quite possible. Others have managed to do it. Why can't we? Mr. Speaker, it is full time we free up the herb for medicinal purposes.
Free up the something.
Mr. Speaker, I wish to focus attention at this time on the environment. Enlightened and responsible people take environmental management seriously and actively seeks ways to mitigate the effects of climate change and environmental degradation. Mr. Speaker, the Minister with responsibility for the environment and climate change portfolio, in his contribution to the sectoral debate last week, spoke at length to the varying levels of multilateral support coming our way to treat with climate change. The truth is, Mr. Speaker, we got nothing beyond that from his presentation. We hear talk every so often about joined-up government. But we must ask, Mr. Speaker, shouldn't joined-up government in this instance between the ministries of local government and the environment be at work regarding the appropriate disposal of waste and the timely cleaning of drains and gullies? Perhaps, Mr. Speaker, if there was true joined-up government and action instead of mere talk, the raging flood waters unleashed on Montego Bay a few weeks ago would not have been as menacing as they were. True. Make no mistake, Mr. Speaker, our activities as inhabitants of the natural and built environment have increased the amount of greenhouse gases in our atmosphere. Mr. Speaker, climate change is a real phenomenon, and the opposition recognizes that the best and most effective tool in the battle against the effects of climate change and managing our environment is managing our environment in a more responsible way. And it starts with the people themselves, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, we on this side understand that the change must begin with the Jamaican people. Our attitude, mindset, and actions must change, and in every way, Mr. Speaker, reflect greater sensitivity and care for the environment. We must engage the ecosystem around us in a manner, Mr. Speaker, that not only preserves its inhabitants, but makes it more conducive to the growth and prosperity of generations to come. This is, Mr. Speaker, is what sustainable development and environmental best practices are all about. And so, Mr. Speaker, we expected to have heard from the Environment and Climate Change Minister on the volume of work that is being done to transform the mindset of our people, because this, Mr. Speaker, is where rubber hits the road. Mr. Speaker, on the question of mindset, there seems to be an air of antagonism, if not downright hostility, exhibited by the government towards non-governmental organizations. Mr. Speaker, we refer specifically to environmental interests in this instance. Those men and women who dedicated their lives to raising the profile of environmental advocacy here in Jamaica, and educating us, Mr. Speaker, about the ill effects of poor environmental management. Mr. Speaker, it's as though the government is not sufficiently seized of the concerns these groups have, the legitimacy of those concerns, and as a result, Mr. Speaker, is paralyzed in pursuing courses of action that reflect greater appreciation for their advocacy. Mr. Speaker, the adversarial relationships between the government and the environmentalists is not doing the country any good. This antagonistic relationship must end, Mr. Speaker. The government must demonstrate through its actions that it recognizes that development can take place where there is as little adverse environmental impact as possible. Sustainable development, Mr. Speaker, is about balancing development interests with consideration for the environment. Mr. Speaker, we must challenge ourselves to reconsider how we are pursuing our development objectives. We must develop, but we must do so on a sustainable basis, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, let me, for a few seconds, reference the Goat Island as a case in point. The proposed development at Goat Islands for the construction of a transshipment port as part of a logistic hub has been fraught with controversy. The manner, Mr. Speaker, in which the government has been proceeding in respect of this development raises more questions than answers. The government's approach leaves much to be desired and illustrates precisely why antagonism and combativeness are characterizing the relationship between itself and key environmental interests. When you think about it, Mr. Speaker, references to two little lizards, as just one example, will not serve to improve the current relationship. In fact, Mr. Speaker, it will only make things worse. That remark not only smacks of arrogance, but is highly unfortunate and downright offensive. The Goat Islands proposal, Mr. Speaker, and the attendant negotiations have not been as transparent as they ought to be. We do not get a sense, Mr. Speaker, as citizens of this country, stakeholders in our own right, that we are being kept abreast of all developments. Mr. Speaker, we must be advised of the commitments the government has already made to the Chinese and the extent of the environmental dislocation these commitments are likely to have. It is highly unacceptable, Mr. Speaker, that the Minister has not been forthcoming in clarifying the government's position on the environmental issues raised thus far. Mr. Speaker, we have no assurance that the government has exhausted all the options available and explored all the alternatives to siting a transshipment port in an area designated as a biosphere reserve. We remain resolute, Mr. Speaker, in our stance that there must be full disclosure regarding the planned development of Goat Islands and the ongoing negotiations with the Chinese. Mr. Speaker, our position is that the government should proceed no further in relation to the proposed Goat Islands development until an independent and credible environmental impact assessment is carried out and made available for consideration. Mr. Speaker, we are insisting that the entity undertaking the environmental impact assessment should be different from the entity which conducted the environmental scoping study. This, Mr. Speaker, will enhance the integrity of the process. Mr. Speaker, just to support a point made by my colleague earlier, Mr. Speaker, we need to ensure that any entity, Mr. Speaker, which will be undertaking an environmental impact assessment is not contracted directly by the potential investor. Such an entity, Mr. Speaker, should simply pay over the required resources to a regulatory agency, but not be involved in the process beyond that.
Makes sense. It's transparent. Very simple.
Mr. Speaker, I am sure that, like me, many would wish to have heard something substantial from the Environment Minister on the question of a coal-fired energy plant. To the extent, Mr. Speaker, that the government is inclined to facilitate the desire of the Chinese investors for a coal-fired facility at Goat Island, one wonders, Mr. Speaker, what the Minister's reaction and contribution to those discussions were. Mr. Speaker, we could debate this issue till the cows come home. My question in relation to this proposed coal-fired facility, Mr. Speaker, is simply this. How many of you members here in this honorable house, how many of you are prepared to live within a 3 to 5 mile radius of a coal-fired energy plant? How many of you would be prepared to countenance the smoke, smog, and other nuisances associated with such a facility? That is the question I ask this honorable house.
That's the question. Absolutely the question.
The member's time for speaking has expired.
Mr. Speaker, I move that the member's time for speaking be extended enough to allow to complete his presentation.
The question is that the member's time
Clean air.
be
A little fallout, yes.
extended sufficient for him to complete his presentation. Those in favor?
Aye.
Those against? Ayes have it. Dr. Wheatley.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, colleagues. Mr. Speaker, reference is often made to the waste disposal facility at Riverton City as a landfill. The truth is, Mr. Speaker, what we have at Riverton City is a dump rather than a landfill. It is quite sad, Mr. Speaker, that the only time the Riverton dump comes up for public discussion is when there is an outbreak of fire and the overhang of some nuisance. For many days, Mr. Speaker. Weeks. For too long, Mr. Speaker, the dump has been operated without an environmental permit. This, Mr. Speaker, in spite of concerns and complaints regarding adverse public health and environmental effects that are likely. The press reported, Mr. Speaker, the Chief Executive Officer of the National Environment and Planning Agency, as saying that his agency will not penalize the National Solid Waste Management Authority, given the financial constraint under which it is operating. I want to ask, Mr. Speaker, the Chief Executive Officer of NEPA, does he allow the same level of latitude to other persons who are acting in contravention of the law as related to environmental issues? I say, Mr. Speaker, what good for goose, good for gander. Mr. Speaker, JET CEO Diana McCauley was quite correct in her response when she described the situation as totally unacceptable. After all, Mr. Speaker, NEPA has a responsibility to enforce environmental laws and should insist on timelines for the National Solid Waste Management Authority to comply. We are alarmed, Mr. Speaker, that while we have been hearing so much from the Minister of Health about the danger of cigarette smoking, we have not heard from him in a commensurate way on the threat to these children. Mr. Minister of Health, this is a public health matter. Again, I ask, where is the joint-up government at work? About the smoke, controlling the smoke, fire.
My teeth them drop out, man. I disrespect the man I use your teeth out with the manners.
From a perspective of responsible environmental management, Mr. Speaker, we propose the following. One, Mr. Speaker, the conversion of the Riverton City dump into a green landfill, Mr. Speaker, a true landfill. The development of a policy of waste separation. The development, Mr. Speaker, of an electronic waste policy. This, Mr. Speaker, is very important. If you consider the number of electrical waste, such as television sets, radios, AC units, refrigerators, batteries, and cell phones, Mr. Speaker. And if you look at the fact that the consumption cycle is just that, just a cycle, it virtually never ends, Mr. Speaker. An e-waste management framework will serve as a catalyst for a new industry and new economic activities which will meaningfully incorporate persons now foraging from the dump.
Yes, go to Cape Town and sell it.
Mr. Speaker,
Yes.
a breakwater system is being prescribed by the authorities as an erosion control agent to be applied in beach restoration and the protection of the Negril shoreline. I am sorry that the Minister of Tourism, who is the Member of Parliament, is not present in the House as we speak on this matter, because the SAP that the Minister of Tourism, who has portfolio responsibility for that area, and knowing that the Negril tourism product contributes 28% of our tourism income, and he himself being a Member of Parliament for that era, is so silent on the matter. Something is wrong. Something is wrong there, and we need to look into it. What is at the bottom of this? Why is the MP and the Minister so silent on this matter?
Conspiracy of silence, yes?
A conspiracy of silence.
Yes.
Mr. Speaker, the proposal to use Sherlock has come for considerable criticism and is staunchly opposed by environmental interests and legal stakeholders. As a result, Mr. Speaker, of its proposed use. The approach, Mr. Speaker, is tantamount to artificially creating something akin to beach rock. Adding a shoreline, Mr. Speaker, can actually make erosion worse. So even if the product does what it says, it may or may not solve the problem. Mr. Speaker, the contentious Negril breakwater system is another example of how not to pursue public policy.
You know, the government come like West Indies cricket team.
Apparent wedge between the government and environmental interests. Persons who are supposed to be partners, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, it cannot be that we have what are supposed to be consultations. Yet when all is said and done, the concerns and submissions made by those with whom you have consulted, especially, Mr. Speaker, when they are quite workable, are not taken on board or in any way reflected in the decisions you have ultimately made. Mr. Speaker, beach nourishment is an option that should be given serious consideration.
Solid point.
Solid point.
Mr. Speaker, I want to now turn my attention to perhaps one of the most important economic sectors for Jamaica, ICT. Mr. Speaker, I listened to the presentations of my counterparts, Ministers Powell and Minister Robinson, last year with cautious optimism. There were a number of announcements made, Mr. Speaker. An ICT roadmap, complete with objectives and timelines, was presented. Mr. Speaker, I stand here today void of that optimism. That optimism, Mr. Speaker, is now replaced with concern and much disappointment. Mr. Speaker, let me be frank, direct, and honest. Notwithstanding a few years of progress, one has no choice but to give the current administration a failing grade when it comes to its stewardship of the ICT sector. Mr. Speaker, let me bring to your attention the World Economics Forum's Annual Global Information Technology Report, GITR for short, Mr. Speaker. This report analyzes the latest developments in our country's ICT sector. It examines how these developments impact national development and benchmarks the country's performance by way of what is referred to as the Network Readiness Index, the NIR. Mr. Speaker, since 2012, Jamaica's NIR has fallen 12 places from 74th to 86. Mr. Speaker, if you look at our ranking compared to our Caribbean counterparts, we come out ahead only in front of Guyana, Haiti, and Cuba. Mr. Speaker, Barbados is currently ranked at 55, while Puerto Rico is at an enviable 21. Mr. Speaker, between 2012 and 2014, 2 missing years where ICT in Jamaica is concerned, we have seen significant fall off in some very important areas. I list them, Mr. Speaker. We have seen a significant fall off as relates to national e-participation, legal framework and laws relating to ICT, intellectual property protection, government's vision of ICT and its importance to future economic growth, government success in ICT promotion, government's online service offerings, government's procurement of advanced technology, and last but not least, Mr. Speaker, venture capital availability. Mr. Speaker, having pointed out these areas above, I want to remind the House of the ICT roadmap presented last year. I do this, Mr. Speaker, because I think it's important to hold the ministers accountable by stating what their targets were and tie this to the current WEF rankings. The goals set out, Mr. Speaker, in the roadmap were no doubt guided by some of the WEF indices, but none, Mr. Speaker, were actually achieved. Mr. Speaker, let me acknowledge the government's continued rollout of community hotspots, a very important component of our Universal Access Services initiative. Of note, Mr. Speaker, are the Digital Jam Conferences, Kingston Animation Festival, rebranding and relaunch of eGov Jamaica Limited, formerly Fiscal Services, the strengthening of our cybercrimes legislation, policies, and establishment of CERT, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, last but not least, the startup of the Tablets in School initiative. All of these things, Mr. Speaker, I've highlighted, were all part of the ICT roadmap and were all slated for completion by the end of the last fiscal year. But, Mr. Speaker, let me now outline the major items in the ICT roadmap that, based on their own timelines, the ministers have failed to complete. And I pluralize the word, Mr. Speaker, I'm speaking to both ministers. I deal with both of them one time. Mr. Speaker, they have failed to table and promulgate the act, the ICT Act, Mr. Speaker. They have failed to table the Data Protection Act. They have failed to amend the outdated Electronic Transaction Act. They have failed to table the proposal for the creation of a single ICT regulator. They have failed to appoint the government CIO. They have failed to complete the government ICT assessment. They have failed to complete the number portability implementation. They have failed to successfully auction 700 megahertz spectrum. They have failed to attract a new telecommunications operator, Mr. Speaker.
Why you didn't bring a dunce cap?
Minister of announcement.
Clearly, Mr. Speaker, by all indications, while we have heard many announcements, the ministers have not been working.
They have been dragged.
They have been doing a lot of talking, Mr. Speaker, and sleeping. As a matter of fact, Mr. Speaker, I am sure that when Minister Robinson makes his contribution to the debate tomorrow, we will no doubt hear more announcements and promises. Maybe even adjustments to his roadmap to avoid the potholes encountered in the previous year. But I say to you, Minister, in the parlance of a popular song from our era, carry about young men, what we need now is action, not a bag of mouth. So, Mr. Speaker, it comes as no surprise. I will speak to the Minister of Entertainment about that.
That has meaning.
Mr. Speaker, it comes as no surprise when one considers these glaring failures that our current standing in the World Economic Forum's Global Information Technology Report is where it is. Mr. Speaker, let me pause to emphasize the fact that this is not all about the numbers. there are many other factors, Mr. Speaker, that we need to consider. These rankings, Mr. Speaker, are very important because many potential investors and multilateral partners use these rankings to determine the state of affairs in our economy as relates to ICT. This, Mr. Speaker, will no doubt have an adverse effect on our economic reform plans and, of course, big-ticket items like the logistic hub. Mr. Speaker, I think that as a nation, we can do better than this. Sure. The government, Mr. Speaker, must ensure that we do better than this. Yes. So, Mr. Speaker, permit me to provide some suggestions and possible solutions to the government as we look for a way forward in this increasingly important sector. Mr. Speaker, we must improve our ICT legislative framework. And we must, Mr. Speaker, review existing legislation to ensure relevance, and where the legislation is lacking, Mr. Speaker, put the relevant legislation in place. Mr. Speaker, the new ICT Act has been a long time coming. When the Jamaica Labour Party debated office, Mr. Speaker, this act had already been tabled for review. 2 years later, still nothing, Mr. Speaker. It is totally unacceptable, Mr. Speaker, that in this day and age, we continue to cling to the laws which do not capture and reflect the realities of the ICT industry of today and the future. We cannot, Mr. Speaker, look to greater use of technology as an enabler for economic growth without the relevant legislation in place. I call on the ministers, get it done. Jamaica cannot wait. Mr. Speaker, with increased use of technology and the use of electronic methods of storing data, we must ensure that we maintain confidence among the people of Jamaica that their personal digital information is safe and secure. The protection of my information, Mr. Speaker, your information, and the information of all citizens of this country is a right, not a privilege. We must ensure, Mr. Speaker, that with the new ways in which information is stored, shared, and accessed, the citizenry is protected and the gatekeepers of this information are held accountable for its use. Digital information, Mr. Speaker, is much easier to access and manipulate. Measures must be put in place to ensure that personal information is kept secure. That is why, Mr. Speaker, the Data Protection Act is so important. Our citizens, Mr. Speaker, must feel confident that when they are encouraged to use technology-driven services, their information will not be compromised or handled inappropriately. Without this level of comfort, Mr. Speaker, among our people, many of the proposed initiatives aimed at improving the efficiency of government services will no doubt fail. Again, I call on the ministers, get it done. Jamaica cannot wait. Mr. Speaker, we are seeing an increase in the need to do more business online, do more transactions online, to communicate via email in a more secure way, facilitate secure transfer and digital signing of documents between MDAs, the private sector, our citizens, and other countries and jurisdictions. Mr. Speaker, the Electronic Transaction Act is one we do not hear much about. This act, Mr. Speaker, was created to provide the legal framework for secured electronic commerce in a bid, Mr. Speaker, to enhance local and international confidence in the integrity and reliability of electronic transactions. Mr. Speaker, it is long overdue for review and amendment. It's a very important act, Mr. Speaker, given the current landscape, and much has changed since 2006. Mr. Speaker, we need to take actions now to plug existing gaps in this act. Again, I call on the ministers, get it done. Jamaica cannot wait. As it currently stands, Mr. Speaker, oversight of the ICT sector is split between the Spectrum Management Authority, the Broadcasting Commission of Jamaica, and the Office of Utilities Regulation. Mr. Speaker, the concept of a single ICT regulator, which took flight under the JP administration in 2009 and which got overwhelming support, Mr. Speaker, from all the major telecommunication players in the market, was designed to bring the ICT regulatory regime more in line with industry trends. Mr. Speaker, in an industry where we are seeing the fusion of products and services, new consumption models, the convergence of voice, data, and video, it is imperative, Mr. Speaker, that we position ourselves to properly and more efficiently monitor, manage, and regulate this environment. Mr. Speaker, there are serious challenges on the horizon. With the advent of over-the-top services and its associated complexities, we must position ourselves to effectively handle these challenges. Mr. Speaker, we continue to see delays in the creation of this regulator. Early this year, Mr. Speaker, we were informed that the responses to the expression of interest for the consultant to enhance the ICT regulatory environment in Jamaica, something that was to have been achieved in 2013. But, Mr. Speaker, by all indications, the completion and subsequent results of this consultancy will not be ready until the last quarter of this year, if not yet next year. Mr. Speaker, this delay will only retard our efforts at unlocking the country's potential through greater oversight and integration of technology. Mr. Speaker, we must signal to the investment community that we are serious about creating the framework for increased competition in the sector and pave the way for the emergence of a vibrant and highly advanced digital economy. Again, I call on the ministers, get it done. Jamaica cannot wait. Mr. Speaker, we continue to see delays in the appointment of the government's chief information officer. With no one to develop and drive a cohesive and comprehensive ICT strategy, we see limited successes in many of the ICT projects the government is undertaking. Mr. Speaker, this proves to be costly and time-consuming. The country cannot afford this. Ministers, again, I implore you, get it done. We cannot wait. Mr. Speaker, we are now embarking on a fundamental paradigm shift in the ICT industry as it relates to how we communicate. New communication models will emerge, and the convergence of voice, data, and video will lead to even more pervasive communication. Mr. Speaker, on 3 separate occasions, we have heard announcements as it relates to number portability and when it will be implemented. Today, Mr. Speaker, we have seen nothing at all. We were told by the minister that number portability rollout will have been completed by the end of 2012. Then by the end of 2013. Then we were told it would have been completed by the end of May 2014. Now we are hearing, Mr. Speaker, that it is the end of 2014. Mr. Speaker, I have to ask the ministers, both of them, when will portability, number portability become a reality? And I hope that Minister Robinson, when he makes his presentation tomorrow, will be definitive as it relates to the real date for the implementation of number portability. Mr. Speaker, we believe that number portability is one of the most critical components to promoting competition in the telecoms market, which, Mr. Speaker, will ultimately result in better value for the majority of consumers. Mr. Speaker, it's a generally held view that Jamaicans don't like to or even want to consider changing their phone numbers in an effort to get a better deal. In addition, Mr. Speaker, it is safe to say that potential new entrants into the telecoms market would be dissuaded by the fact that after contemplating, Mr. Speaker, the huge investment of building out mobile or fixed line networks, they would have an uphill battle of convincing people to switch to their network. Simply, Mr. Speaker, because consumers would have to consider changing their numbers to benefit from the services of a new provider. Mr. Speaker, this fundamental freedom of choice is being denied the Jamaican people by delay in implementing number portability. Mr. Speaker, the increased value and benefits of competition are being denied by the Jamaican people, or to the Jamaican people. The increase in job opportunities and business opportunities are being stymied because of delays in number portability, Mr. Speaker. Again, I call on the ministers, get it done. Jamaica cannot wait. Mr. Speaker, I want to briefly speak on the government's recent failure to successfully auction the 700 megahertz spectrum band. Mr. Speaker, it was apparent that the auction was ill-conceived and doomed to fail from the start. One possible reason for this is the failure to implement number portability, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the minister was clearly over-ambitious. Some might say overly exuberant in his expectations. Having failed to create, Mr. Speaker, an ideal and attractive environment for that level of investment. Mr. Speaker, this may be a reason the minister found himself in the precarious position of having to use this valuable national resource as a bargaining chip, Mr. Speaker, when negotiating with the telecoms providers to assist the country in meeting its primary surplus targets by renewing their license almost a year ahead of time. Mr. Speaker, I have tabled some questions today for the minister to answer in the next 21 days that relates to his own aggregate spectrum cap policy, Mr. Speaker. The minister needs to come clean on this matter. Mr. Speaker, it is clear that the government has failed to create the environment for the attraction of a new entrant into the telecoms market. Mr. Speaker, in order to realize the full potential of the wireless broadband sector, engender competition, and attract new investments in the sector, the government must do the following. The government needs to expedite the harmonization of the ICT legislative framework, need to accelerate the implementation of number portability, modify the taxation regime for providers, and create, Mr. Speaker, new market possibilities and business opportunities through the advancement of major initiatives like mobile money. These are the kinds of things, Mr. Speaker, that will spur greater interest in our market. Mr. Speaker, mobile money, yet another area identified as one with immense possibility, has yet to see any major traction here in Jamaica. Mr. Speaker, the current mobile landscape presents a golden opportunity for government to look at more innovative ways of widening the tax net by engendering greater participation in the country's financial system. It, Mr. Speaker, will create new markets, new service-oriented products, not to mention greater convenience for our citizens in conducting their day-to-day business transactions. Mr. Speaker, in a recently released opinion paper by the Jamaica Information Technology and Services Alliance, JITSA, it was highlighted that the government needs to look more seriously at ICT as a national utility. The government, Mr. Speaker, must adopt a perspective that ICT is as important to national infrastructure as energy, water, and roads. Mr. Speaker, JITSA goes on to say that economic reform cannot be successful without ICT. Mr. Speaker, I cannot overemphasize these statements enough. ICT plays an integral role in the success of the country's economic reform programs. There are countless studies and reports that definitively show the positive effect that ICT and its adoption has on jobs, salaries, and overall GDP. But as outlined in the JITSA opinion paper, Mr. Speaker, successive administrations have not taken a cohesive approach to ICT adoption at the national level. This needs to change. This needs to change now, Mr. Speaker. To do this, we believe that strong partnership must be forged between the public sector, private sector, and stakeholder groups like JITSA, BPIAJ, and JCS to first secure the reform needed in ICT at the national level, which will ultimately aid in the success of our economic programs. Public-private partnerships, Mr. Speaker, are a key component to the success of ICT reform, and we must do everything in our power to facilitate this. Mr. Speaker, the final area I want to briefly touch on is the role of the ICT will play in the logistic hub. Mr. Speaker, the opposition believes that there is tremendous opportunity for ICT in this project, and if executed in the right way, will lead to huge economic benefits. We must ensure, Mr. Speaker, that the necessary infrastructure is in place to facilitate the massive data requirements of the technology associated with operating environment of a logistic hub or logistic operation. Mr. Speaker, the seamless integration of data between air, land, and sea operations is critical to efficient provision of services and decision-making. We all have to look, Mr. Speaker, at our one-time mentee, Singapore, and how its adoption of technology in this era has affected their economy. This is something, Mr. Speaker, that we must get right. We must ensure that policies and legislations are in place to marshal the effective and efficient use of data and infrastructure, while providing, Mr. Speaker, the ideal environment to take advantage of import and export-led economic growth activities. I would like to, again, Mr. Speaker, stress to the government the importance of engagement with all the relevant stakeholders in the ICT industry. There are opportunities, Mr. Speaker, here for all, not only for the large service providers, but for the small ones as well. Mr. Speaker, I began my presentation highlighting the importance of accountability. My review of the sectors my portfolio cover has found the ministers wanting. Mr. Speaker, Jamaicans all over are clear about one thing. They are tired of the government's lip service, grand announcement, and talk rather than action. As I close, Mr. Speaker, I wish to emphasize the following. One of the most important things right now is for us to move as a people from being a nation that only consumes technology to becoming a nation of producers and innovators of technology. The government must take seriously our ranking in various global indices and improve them as they are taken into account by people who contemplate making investments in Jamaica. The government must demonstrate that the Jamaican people are vital to everything we set out to achieve as a country. And as such, Mr. Speaker, investments need to be made in their training and development, as well as their attitudes towards environment, science in general, and ICTs. The government must awake from its slumber, Mr. Speaker, and bring key ICT-related legislation to Parliament as we set the stage for increased competition, enhanced data integrity, and greater value to stakeholders in the sector. Mr. Speaker, the government must make full disclosure regarding commitments it has made to the Chinese in relation to the Goat Islands. The government must become more accommodating, Mr. Speaker, and appreciative of the views of key stakeholders like the environmental advocates, and concentrate, Mr. Speaker, efforts on cauterizing the antagonistic relationship it has with these stakeholders. Mr. Speaker, the government must ensure that Jamaica is not left behind in ganja reform. We need a legal framework in facilitating medicinal marijuana and must stop destroying the future of our people, especially youth, by giving them a criminal record for the possession of a mere spliff. Mr. Speaker, our word to the wise is sufficient. I thank you and I thank the members of this honorable House. Good afternoon.